The years of peace are startled by the call, and like the deer at season's opening dawn, first hears the shot and staggers, does not fall. The nations tremble, but the world goes on. Our fathers once did light the darkening skies, and died so we might see another day. We hear again the bugles and the cries, the threatening thunder of the distant fray.
I can remember the day the war started. I was 12 years old. I was at the Toronto exhibition on September the 5th, 1939.
In 1939, I was 10 years old. And I didn't have a great deal of knowledge about what the war was all about, but it carried on until 1945.
My father, by 1940, he knew that something was going to happen. He knew that he was so close to the Japanese bankers that he knew there was going to be a war.
At that time, my sister was at a convent school, and the Mother Superior decided that as many children as possible should leave England, and she offered to evacuate the school. About half of them went, and then she offered to take any of the brothers of the girls who were there, and about a dozen of us went. So I think I was told by my parents on a Friday that they decided I would be going to Canada and I would be leaving on Monday.
When the war started, my dad went to the States. He was actually sent to the States by the British government, and my mother, being American, went with him and had no problem, going and living in the States. So my dad wanted me to go to school in the British tradition. So he looked at all the schools in Canada, Ridley, Upper Canada, TCS, SAC, and a couple more, and he picked Ridley. So, which was, I think, a very good choice.
The dire decision was made that I should go to school in Canada. My father said he wasn't having the boy under the American flag, he wanted it under a British flag. So it was to be Ridley. I think probably chosen by Jim Bissicker's parents. I'm sure it was, in fact, because Jim's father, I think, had similar views to my father's about being under the flag.
Because I was evacuated during the war with my two sisters, and we lived with an uncle and aunt in Toronto, and they sent me to Forest Hill School in Toronto. And my dad was very keen that I should go to boarding school, and thank God he worked for an American company. So of course in those days it was impossible to get currency from England to Canada. It was forbidden, and therefore most parents couldn't pay for any extras. But my dad, working for an American company, was able to get the American company to pay for me to move to Ridley, and so that's how it was.
In 1940, a Ridleian called Robert Rumble finished at the school, and this father said, "We'd like to do our war effort and send this English youngster to Ridley and pay." And my father couldn't pay. So this was agreed.
I went on an American freighter called the American Merchant, and I think it probably had 5 cabins for passengers or something. And but it was a peaceful journey, and so it was just the crossing of the Atlantic, really.
The boat we wanted to go on, we couldn't get to Liverpool to get on it. It was, as it happened, it was the Athenia. Just as well we didn't go on it. Instead we went on a Dutch ship, the Western Land, the Holland-America line. The Germans hadn't invaded the Netherlands by then, so it was a neutral ship. And it had floodlights projecting from the back of the ship onto the ship to show that it was the Western Land and a Dutch ship. And so we made that journey without difficulty.
One of the boys who came out, I think it was Milligan, was booked on the SS Athenia, which I don't know if you've ever heard of, yes, but it was one of the first ships to be torpedoed. But by the grace of God, he missed the sailing. And the SS Athenia went down, and I think there were only a handful of people who were saved. It was just, that was the first U-boat kill in the war.
We wiggled our way across the Atlantic. We were escorted by a destroyer for a couple of days, and we landed in Montreal, and we were put up for the weekend at Lower Canada College, which was, they treated us very well there. They showed us around Montreal, took us up to the cross at the top, and then we were put on a train and ended up in Oakville, Ontario. That's when my first connection with Ridley came, because for the first month Terry Cronin came and looked after us there.
In 1939 I was 10, and it wasn't all that different, foreign, from the English school I'd been at. The accents were different.
Everybody talked differently, and a lot of the Canadian kids had been to the local public school or whatever, and we'd been to private schools in Britain, and I think we were much more proper and nicely behaved than a lot of they were, but they were very accepting of us and very welcoming, so it was turned into a very good experience.
I don't think we were treated any differently to Canadian boys. As you know, Ridley's always been a very international school, so the fact that some boys that roughly spoke the same language came to the school didn't faze them in any way.
The English kids were different, and a lot of them, their parents were 3,000 or 4,000 miles away, so the teachers were very, very kind.
A lot of the chaps were from other countries who couldn't be visited at all, and the teachers were absolutely wonderful.
And the teaching, the lessons were about the same, except the subjects were different. Latin, I don't think, was being taught at that time, but it was taught possibly by Mr. Guest, who had Latin, but I don't think it was taught by the school. I think he probably taught me privately, I should think, which was good of him.
Well, the first one I knew was Hick Brown, the lower school headmaster,
who was larger than life creature, I think.
His skill at teaching things to boys was just unbelievable. To give an example, boys of what age were we, 8, 9, 10, he would explain to us in great detail with drawings on the blackboard how an internal combustion engine worked. How the pistons moved, how the spark plugs worked, how the petrol pump worked, or gas pump as you would say. And to this day, that came in very useful to me, and to this day I remember his teachings.
Typically, Hick Brown punishment was we'd been caught kicking other boys across the table, underneath the table, kick, kick, kick. So he lined up two rows of chairs and sat one lot of us over here and the other lot of us over there. He said, okay, start kicking. So we had to kick each other, or pretend to kick each other, until he'd had enough of it. And they said, okay, off you go. That was our punishment.
Captain Littleton really, made sure he talked to every boy. Most of the masters made sure they talked to every boy too. It was really a good time to be there.
Then it was Hammy, because I was sent to Merritt House. Hamilton was the housemaster.
He was the greatest teacher ever. My roommate John Murray was a lovely guy, but pretty dim. Hammy got him through.
We had Mr. Ashburner, who was a great mathematics teacher, and he was lovely. He only had one eye, but Ashburner was loved by us all.
Must have been taught by Griffith one time. I think he taught us French.
He used to come and lecture to the lower school about once a month, I suppose, and his lectures were quite fascinating. He was a very, very good speaker.
Dr. Griffith used to talk about the morals of the school and the things that went on in the world.
Ridley was certainly character building, and these were a big part of it.
Dr. Betts I remember particularly because he was music, and he was very good as far as we were concerned. He was very good at drilling the choir.
Mr. Hanna was probably the one I do remember, teaching us the mathematics.
Then we had Mad Jack Matheson.
Matheson, I did Latin with him in all three forms. I did Principal Latin in the sixth form, so we got on very, very well with him.
Then we had Terry Cronin, who was a wonderful guy. He left his soul with all of us.
Terry Cronin was a wonderful teacher, and his nickname was Twitch, because he had a paralyzed arm that went like that, and he had to grab it and go like that again. And but he was just a lovely, lovely man, and never married, and very, very partial and friendly to all the English boys. And he was a very fine person.
And that's typical of Ridley people. They would call people by names that made people recognize who they were.
See if I can remember a few nicknames. I was Chappie.
Yes, I had the dreadful nickname of Mike, which drove me crackers, but as you well know, in North America, if your name is Michael, you are Mike, and occasionally Spike, whether you like it or not.
Several people called me Alge, for Algernon, because they couldn't get a hold of Oldham. So Alge and Algie.
They just called me Rod.
Well, I mean, apart from being called Millie, which is what I mean, naturally, it's just I'm busy. Jim was busy, so that was that.
Well, my nickname was just Biss. Nothing like Milligan's nickname was Millie. Speaking of James Milligan, oh my God, where did that come from?
Oh, I can see Bissica. Oh yes, aren't we respectable?
So those Ridley names stuck.
Ridley sort of timetable and everything was so much like school I'd been at in England that it wasn't much of a culture shock, I don't think.
Well, it started with chapel, which I think must have been about 8:30, for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then there were classes until lunch. And then I think we finished about 3:20. And then there was sport until about 5 o'clock. And then there was supper, and then there was study.
The names of the rooms were surprising. I slept in a dormitory called Tecumseh. It was a big long room. I'm guessing now, I think it might have had 15 boys in it. I think we might have had 2 bells to go to bed. The first bell was to, we should have had our teeth brushed and washed by the first bell, and then we had to stand in parade and have our hands and teeth inspected. And unless you had passed the previous week, I think, without being reprimanded for anything, in which case you were considered to be an exempt. And so that was really a great help, because you got to bed earlier if you're an exempt.
At school, in the dormitory, because we spent, you know, obviously the cold nights as well in the winter. I do remember covering myself virtually right up until my nose to keep my body warm.
One time there was a very big snowstorm, and we couldn't get food into the school. They could only get food as far as St. Paul Street, and we took toboggans and we went out and brought the food back from a truck that was parked in front of a drugstore that was there called Benny Binders. And that was sort of fun.
When I was at Ridley, there used to be, I don't know if it's still there, a wilderness adjacent to the school, which went right down to the Old Ridleian Canal. And there was a small stream running through there. And I used to spend a lot of time looking for toads, frogs, mice, rabbits, what you will. And we also behaved like beavers and dammed the stream and created a little lake and so on.
I did a lot of carpentry. We used to make lead soldiers. One of the boys had one of these things where you boil lead and pour it into molds and so on. And then summers, first 2 summers we went to, we were given the use of the University of Toronto Engineers Camp in Muskoka. So we were on the lake there for a month. I mean, that was a totally new experience, canoeing and all that sort of thing.
At Ridley, I remember very well indeed, is another boy and I went for a walk and came across a pond quite a long way from the school, a mile or 2 from school, and it was frozen, and boys will be boys. We decided to slide on the ice, and the ice broke, and my friend went through into the freezing water, and I tried to pull him out, but every time he got up onto the edge of the ice, it broke again, and he fell back in again. And I thought that the end had come, but fortunately a local farmer heard us shouting and brought a ladder which he laid horizontally across the ice, and by distributing the weight of the boy across the ladder, the ice would then bear his weight, and so we managed to get out and sneaked back to Ridley, had a hot shower and didn't breathe a word to anybody.
And one of my greatest achievements was we stole 6 straps from the master's rooms and studies, 6 of them, which meant every time, for 6 times, they went to give the boy a strap. There was no strap. So then they had to get another one. That was a real achievement.
One of the very old ice rink was, you know, obviously now has been completely renovated, but the old ice rink, I think, was just the ice was just made because of the water coming from the taps or from the hoses, to make sure that the ice rink was suitable for us to play ice hockey. I do remember playing ice hockey, and that was good fun.
I was sort of a mild-mannered English little boy. Gus was a big wheeler dealer from Buffalo, but Gus was German-American, you know, his name Schneider, you know, and so probably the family sympathized with the Germans at that point in time more than the British and the Canadians and everyone. So he picked on me Finally one day I got him in the basement of the school and we had a fight, and I creamed him, and that was the end of it.
The one thing that did happen, and I don't know how it happened, why it happened, but we all got punished for it. For some reason, a hate developed against the barbers who used to come to the school. And one morning it was a dreadful rush of boys through the school, all shouting, "Boo, barber, boo, barber, boo, barber," which wasn't very nice for the barber, I don't suppose. Anyway, we all got punished roundly for that, but I can't remember what happened to us, but it was, didn't do it again, anyway.
I think the masters thought that we were deserved some fun. I really do, because they sort of knew what was going on in the world. I think that they watched what was going on and sort of stood back and said, "Hope they don't get in trouble." So that was good.
Never again have I had the opportunity to play so much sport. I did at Ridley. I really enjoyed that.
Games, that was the term for Canadian football, which I really enjoyed doing. It was wonderful stuff. It was, unlike American football, where you take people out of the game, you had to go sideways and block them. You could actually tackle. And this is something I quite enjoyed doing.
We played cricket in the spring of the year, and we had a lot of fun playing cricket, but we were not allowed to play baseball. And one of the great amusing days was the fact that St. Catharines were the champion hardball team in the area, and somebody got talking to them. We were the champion cricket team, and so we decided to have a competition. And we didn't have any hardball gloves or anything, just bare hands. And our group went out dressed like cricketers in our white flannels and white shirts. And we beat them roundly, but even the masters skipped out to see it.
The only one I was any good at was athletics. I was the high jumper. And in fact, I've still got a napkin ring which was awarded me as first prize for the high jump at the lower school.
Obviously we did all the things that kids at a boys' school do in the way of sports and recreation and going to the library and reading, and obviously a bit of studying as well. But from quite an early age, from the age of 14 I think, a lot of us would go and work on farms because there were no men around anywhere. The only males that were around were too beaten up and useless to do anything. Everybody else was in the services. And so we picked fruit, we loaded and unloaded freight cars, unloaded and loaded ships. Used to work when a ship came into the docks. This is from the age of about 14 on. When a ship came into the docks in St. Catharines in the Welland Canal, we had a phone line to them, and they would call us and say, "Can you come down tonight? What time?" "Midnight." So we kept bicycles at a farm across the fields, would cycle down, work all night, loading ships. Real men's work, 500-pound bales of cotton or whatever, and back on the bikes in time for breakfast at 7:30 or 8 o'clock.
We were allowed 10 cents a week pocket money, and 2 cents had to go to our church collection, and so we needed to earn a bit more money, and I used to go around and cut the grass for people, apart from picking strawberries and other berries when farmers wanted help.
I started a bed making business in the lower school at Ridley, and I made about maybe a maximum of 10 beds on a weekly payment basis, and the payment could be in comic books or it could be in cash, but usually in kind. And so then when I got the comic books, then I had a comic book rental business. So for anybody that didn't want to spend 10 cents to buy a comic book, they could rent one for 2 cents or something. And so it was good value for everybody, was happy.
All the old comics papers that were thrown away, we collected them. We might make a bit of money out of selling them, which in fact was the case. But as soon as word got about, we were summoned to the headmaster's study and told to bring all the money that we'd made and all the newspapers we had, and told never to do it again.
The war was a challenge to everybody.
As an English kid, it was quite easy to feel lonely some of the time.
School life, you know, is very busy. You don't really have time to think a lot about. You're kept well occupied at Ridley with classes and then games every afternoon. I don't know, we just seemed to take things in our stride.
Ridley was totally involved in the war, and well, just starting with Remembrance Day, and they read all the names of those who died in the First and then the Second World War, and the list of names slowly grew, and it was very moving experience.
Well, I do remember him always reading out who had died. And the only one I knew was John Scott, who Terry brought with him to the Muskoka camp the first summer we were there. He was later lost in the Navy.
This was a very difficult period because we had rationing in Canada then. We said canned goods were virtually impossible to get. They all were sent over to Britain, Liverpool.
Oh yes, everything was rationed. Everything from clothing to food to coal, everything was rationed.
I was in, I think, Merritt House. There was a Merritt House. Memories there of Ridley old boys buzzing the house in their Harvard trainers. I don't mean their shoes, I mean their aeroplanes. And because they were excited about getting their wings, they would come and show off over the house.
I don't remember students with horrible news, but I mean we followed the ebb and flow of the war every day, yes.
But I do remember having letters, a lot of letters from my sisters.
Letter writing became sort of a must, and my mother and father always used to write once a week.
I think they were called aerograms. If you wrote a letter, the postal services photographed the letter and reduced it to postage stamp size, and then it came across as airmail. That was to reduce the weight of mail being shipped across the Atlantic. And then it was blown up again in Canada to a readable size.
One thing that was typical, I guess, of people that were in prisoner of war camps, when they wrote letters, they didn't use their right name. And I can remember Rodney Box, whose name had lived in China. His name was Rodney Thomas Hollyoak Box. And the masters received a letter from somewhere in the Orient addressed to Thomas Rodney Hollyoak, and I heard them talking about the name, and it was a letter from Rod's father in a prisoner of war camp. So there were things like that that went on that just made your hair stand on end, because you realized that it could be your father that was in a prisoner of war camp.
The school used to cut the headlines out of the newspapers, paste them up on a board and put them around the walls of the long room. And I think after Dunkirk it all didn't seem to be quite so serious for a small boy, I suppose.
I shall never forget trying to cross the Atlantic during the war in a boat. Never forget. It was a banana boat, 5,000 ton, not very big. It took 4 weeks. And coming into London dock at the end of the trip, there was a flying bomb. You know, these things that come and they suddenly, engine stop, down. So this happened on my first day back in the UK. These bloody flying bombs came down. That was a shock.
There was a lovely old lady, well up in her 90s, on the troop ship coming home. And we were warned that, I said to her, why are you coming back on a very uncomfortable convoy, troop ship, before the war has ended? She said, because I am very old and I am determined to be buried in England. Anyway, that night we were warned that there was going to be an artificial a practice attack on the convoy. We were about 30 ships, and we were told there would be an awful racket of gunfire and so on, depth charges. The old lady didn't hear this, and when the racket started, with huge plumes of water being thrown up by depth charges and aeroplanes dive bombing and so on, she thought we were being attacked, and she had a heart attack and died. And I remember early the next morning, I got up at 5 o'clock before anyone was about, and I came across the funeral service, and the good lady was laid on a plank at the side of the ship, and the coffin was, well, not actually coffin, it was a sailcloth bag draped with the Union Jack, and the prayers were said, and then they tipped up the plank that she was lying on, and she disappeared into the briny. And a lady, one of the sailors, reached over quickly, grabbed the Union Jack back and said, we'll need that again for the next one.
Sometime about the beginning of March, I think, my mother rang up the housemaster and said, look, James is having a birthday party. You know, I'm desperate for him to come back. Could he please come back for a birthday party? So I was duly sent back for the birthday party, and my mother said, well, actually, it's not a birthday, you're going back to England. I think I put this in a note I wrote. They said, I was just getting chicken pox at the time. She said, don't scratch the spots or they won't let you onto the boat. So about the middle of March, I think it was the 15th, my sister, elder sister, took me, I should have said accompanied me because I wasn't very pleased to be led about by my sister, to New York, where we spent the night in a hotel. And I suppose in some ways it was quite an eventful voyage. It was a sort of navy ship, but it had been a passenger liner. It had lots of little cabins for the passengers, and I think it was called a submarine depot ship at that time, and the cabins were there for the submarine crews to recuperate in between tours of duty. Cabins were pretty stark. The bunk was about 4 feet off the floor, and the floor was just metal. This was relevant later on when we were out in the Atlantic, and the ship's steering gear broke down, so the ship lost its way and was broadside onto the waves and started to roll. And as it rolled, the spray broke over to the deck above my cabin. The water started leaking in, which was a pain because my mother had given me a bag of oranges for my father, and I could see the bag was getting wet and dissolving, and I wasn't quite sure what my father would say about having these oranges covered in salt water. So anyway, they floated to and fro past my bunk, and I reached out and grabbed them as they went by. I wasn't going to get out into the water because that was salt water sloshing about. But I managed to collect them all, and I got them in my suitcase, and eventually did deliver them to my father, where they were appreciated.
When I got back to England, and my parents had a flat, an apartment in London, and when we were staying in London, there were things called flying bombs, pilotless bombs that came over London. The first series were called Doodlebugs, or their proper title was V1. And these bombs came over and you could hear them drone with the motor. And when the motor stopped, you knew that bomb was going to descend. So if a little boy was lying in bed and you heard this very distinctive engine note and then suddenly it stopped, you had about 10 seconds to count before you knew whether the bomb had landed near you or far away. And those 10 seconds, I can tell you, were quite exciting. The later version, the V2, was a rocket bomb, and that came over more like an artillery shell. And so when that exploded, if you were still alive, you knew that you hadn't been hit. So you didn't have that dreadful 10 seconds wait. When we were at our home in the countryside near here, a bomb, the nearest we ever got to a bomb dropped in the field, a couple hundred yards from our house one night. And the next day, myself and my sisters went to play in the crater. It was twice the size of that desk, I suppose, the crater. And we were playing in it and, playing silly war games and so on. And then that night, there was one hell of a bang. And the next morning, we looked out, and where that crater had been, there was a crater half the size of this room. And in fact, the crater, the original crater, had been made by an unexploded bomb, which was timed to blow up 24 hours later. And so we were fairly lucky. Modern war, men were charging at our flank, shells were screaming overhead. At our backs a giant tank drove through hundreds, hurt or dead. Then our reinforcements came and shouts of triumph filled the skies. The foe kept fighting just the same, but now new hope shone from our eyes. Then we saw their leader fall, they all turned tail in wild retreat. We'd heard the strident bagpipes call and knew our victory was complete.
I do remember when the war was over in 1945, we were allowed to go into town, and they had huge celebrations all over.
VE Day was the day that we did the snake dances around Ridley and downtown, and we were shouting and singing, and everybody was just absolutely delighted.
The whole world, the whole town, the city of St. Catharines went wild. And of course everybody that drank was drunk, and everybody that didn't drink might just as well have been drunk because they were so happy. And there were bonfires in the streets and fireworks and everybody hugging everybody, and it was just a lovely, lovely feeling,
We just had a very happy feeling the war was over, and that our dads and our older brothers and uncles and so on would be coming back, and we would see them again. And there's great happiness about that.
The following day, we had a holiday, and we were able to listen to Churchill speaking and the King, and then we had a cadet parade, I think, in the afternoon. In the evening, I went with Moose to see a film, which I keep a diary, so I know these things. It was called Hotel Berlin for some strange reason. I suppose it was the only film on in town. That night, a lot of boys either went out or just stayed out, and there were great ructions the following day.
My father decided that because the war had finished in England. 1945 finished, and of course I was sent back to England because my father wanted me to go to an English public school. I hated leaving because I didn't want to leave all my friends, and I was very, very sad at having to leave my school.
The whole Canadian experience certainly broadened my view of life. As I said, I had a year in an English secondary school, and then I did national service in the RAF for 2 years. But I didn't go abroad then. And then I had to find a job. And England was really a depressing place, especially after Canada.
I think if you had a good education and a tough environment while you're having it, which a boys' boarding school is, and I'd learned how to fight with Gus Schneider, the German-American.
Look out for yourself.
Yeah, and all the school activity and everything, the school just becomes part of you.
I'm a great supporter of that school. They did a lot of good to me. A lot of good to me.
I'm very grateful to have had a Ridley education. It's made a huge difference to my life.
No, I think the school enriched my life for sure, and that of all of us that went there.
It's a wonderful experience going to Ridley. I'm very fond of the school, and they certainly did well by all of us kids.
Peter was very focused and determined and sort of straightforward. And if there's any trouble, he would go right in there and try and sort it out. He's the most admirable person.
He was a very straight, honest, fine kid. I mean, really a super boy. He remained a lifelong friend of mine.